I am Quiara Alegría Hudes. I am the playwright and director of My Broken Language. And you can call me Geeky.
Could you talk about what's unique about the North Philadelphia area and how that location shaped your upbringing?
The play is set in West Philly, where I grew up, and in North Philly, where most of my extended family was. One of the things about Philadelphia is it's one of the most diverse cities in this nation, and it's also the fourth most segregated city in this nation. And so that has its pros and cons. I grew up between these neighborhoods and really seeing like North Philly was a closed system. It bothered me because I saw like there wasn't trash pickup in the same way that there was in Center City when I went and visited my friend in Center City. They didn't even have trash cans on the corner in North Philly. You know, so there's litter on the ground. Like it really bothered me that the kids were out playing with that. The flip side of that coin though was that those sort of segregated communities were preserved a lot of culture and were places that cultural innovation kept happening and continued because we were in close quarters. We were stopping being island Boricuas and starting being Philly Ricans together. And so there was a cultural preservation that was really, really wonderful and special too. And so in the play, My Broken Language, I'm grappling with loving these elements of the culture, but also being really angry and furious with the implications of segregation. For instance, there's a scene where I'm dealing with educational inequality in the city. I got to go to a magnet school that brought in kids from all over the city, which is part of the public school system. My cousin was one of many who went to the local school. And just me witnessing the discrepancies in our education, there's a scene about that. And how do I reconcile the different opportunities that my more integrated education afforded me versus my cousin whose segregated education was compromised?
Quiara, what was the original impetus for writing your memoir?
The impetus for writing my memoir, ironically, was I needed a break from the theater. I had been, hitting it hard for 20 years, and I wanted to be in a different artistic space for some time. So I wrote a book that I have now adapted into a play, and I'm coming back to the stage.
And how has the process of adapting been so far, and how have you chosen or will continue to choose what you bring forward from the book into the play?
So the thing that inspired, like the first idea in the book, came from a memory, which was all my cousins dancing at my abuela's house in North Philly on the 4th of July, 1991. And I know it's that because when you used to do VHS tapes, there would be like a data mark, like a watermark of the date and time. And so I had that on the VHS tape. And it was beautiful. We're all dancing to merengue. This really important album had come out, which was Juan Luis Guerra's Bachata Rosa, which was one of the most important albums of the decade. And then I started remembering that in 1991, that was a really challenging time in my family. It was HIV time, it was war on drugs time. There was a lot of grief happening in those years in my family, and that juxtaposition between the grief and this incredible joy I saw in this dance party, it was that excited me as a storyteller. I thought there's tension there, there's narrative there, there's story, and I wanted to explore exactly that intersection of the joy and the pain. And then the book became a much more sprawling investigation, but with the play, I wanted to return to an exploration of that joy and celebration and grief as it lives within our bodies. I'm like, I want to get incredible actors on stage, and I want to explore the parts of this book that really focus on our bodies at moments of transition and at moments of real complexity.
Great, thank you. So this is your first time as a director. what interested you, or why did you want to direct this play? And how do you plan to balance those dual roles of playwright and director?
So here comes my first time as a director. I can't say that I've ever really dreamed of being a director, but it felt very natural for this particular project. I've worked with incredible directors throughout my career, so I really could have taken this opportunity to collaborate, but I have some experience in collaborating. And with a director, just as with a songwriter when I'm writing a musical, or, you have to give them a lot of space to be their own artists. And I could just feel that it would be hard for me to give a director that much space in stories that were so personal, in stories that I've essentially lived and that continue to live in my memories. And I didn't want to be hovering. I didn't want to be like a helicopter playwright always over the director's shoulder. So I just thought, okay, well, let me try this one on for size. And it's not that as a director that I want to replicate these memories as is, because memory is fuzzy. Memory is a feeling. Memory is a vibe. But the kind of exploration I want to do with the actors, the kind of frank conversations I want to have with them about what does the Latina body mean in an intergenerational family? How do we make sounds together? How do we touch each other? How do we heal each other? How do we fight? These are really personal conversations, and so I'm so glad that I'll get to be the one leading them in the room.
Great. How will music and dance be incorporated into the world of the play, and what will your collaborators, Ebony Williams and Alex Lacamoire, contribute to this piece?
So we have Ebony Williams, who's a really, really ferocious and gifted choreographer. And again, because the seed and the impetus for this piece comes from a memory of dancing, I really wanted our physique, our embodied presence to be heightened in this. And so we have actors and dancers in our ensemble, and they're all going to be doing everything. The actors are going to be dancing, the dancers are going to be acting, and some of those pieces are going to be quite literal and pretty straightforward. For instance, there's a scene where I witness my mother in a moment that I really don't understand as a child. She had a spiritual gift growing up that I didn't have, and I witnessed her in a moment of spirit possession. And it was both thrilling and pretty terrifying for me as a child. And so we're going to have a piece of choreography that captures how I felt my mother's body transform. It's fairly straightforward, even though it's a heightened story. But we're also going to have dance that's playful. We have something called a rice ballet. There's a scene where I'm just remembering my abuela's recipe for white rice. And we don't write down our recipes in the community. We learn them and metabolize them until they become second nature. And so we're going to do a rice ballet. It's utterly silly and ridiculous, but I also want the audience to have moments of levity and fun to balance against some of the more serious themes of the book and play. We have Alex Lacamoire, who is our music supervisor. And Alex and I go way back. He's one of the first artists I met when I moved to New York because he was working on In the Heights, which I was also working on. Later in our collaborative relationship, he composed an original score for Vivo, which is an animated movie I wrote for Netflix. So when my memoir came out, I asked Alex, would he play piano at the paperback release party? And I asked him to play piano at that because one of the languages in my broken language is music. I grew up as a musician. I played Bach, I played Chopin, I played Beatles tunes, and so the book talks a lot about music as an important means of expression for myself. And so I wanted to bring all of that kind of musical world, bring the Bach, bring the Chopin, bring the Juan Luis Guerra merengue, bring those vocabularies into the piece as well.
Great, thank you. So amongst your cast, Or let's talk about the full cast first. What excites you about working with this cast and with Ariadne, your musician?
I grew up in a large and largely matriarchal family in North Philly. It was a lot of female and women's bodies all around me at all times, from 8 months to 88 years old. It was a wonderland to see that diversity of bodies. There was what we would say, there was chicken legs and righteous thighs, like that diversity of hair textures and skin tones. This is an Afro-descended, indigenous-descended, Philly Rican family. So we carried all that in our bodies. There were scars, there were tattoos, there were cigarettes, there were beer bellies, there were sober people. And, when my elders came to Philadelphia from Puerto Rico, they had a suitcase of clothes, I suppose, but they really didn't bring a material life with them. They didn't bring wealth with them because they didn't have wealth. What they brought with them was the stories, and they brought their bodies. And so I actually feel that those bodies are my inheritance. Those stories are my inheritance, more than material items. So I just wanted to find a group of amazing, fascinating, strong, energized, ferocious bodies, and the spirits that come with them. So we created an ensemble of Latinas that are kind of sort of my age. We have some a little bit older, we have some a little bit younger, and they're going to be those bodies that were around me, swirling, dancing, healing, cursing, grieving, laughing. They're going to bring their life experience and their vibes to my own story.
And amongst that company, you spoke about collaboration, are Daphne Vega and Sabrina Guerra. How is it to reunite and work with them in your new role as director, and just to continue a collaboration with people that you already have relationships with?
Two of our cast members are actors I've worked with for a long time and I know really well. And I would say that over those decades I've worked with them, we've built up a lot of trust. But actually, it's those relationships where the trust is kind of instant because you can tell there's an unspoken language between you. Sabrina Guevara, she's one of the first artists I work with when I moved to New York. My first play in New York was called Elliot, A Soldier's Fugue. And there I was back then, still mixing up the Bach preludes and fugues with the Philly Rican stories. I haven't given up on that sort of mixture yet, obviously. And she was in that play. So she was in my first New York play. She originated the role of Ginny. She originated the role of Yasmin in Water by the Spoonful. She's been with my work. She originated the role of Beatrice in 26 Miles. She's funnier than I am, nerdy like I am. She's so down to earth and real, and all of those qualities. And she's amazing with language. She can juggle a lot of language, and so all of those qualities just make my work alive. I love what she does with my work. Daphne Rubin Vega. I can't remember the first time we've collaborated, but she is one of the most rock and roll people I've ever met. And I don't mean the Rolling Stones, I don't mean Pink Floyd, I mean her spirit is one of profound rebellion. And I love what she brings to my work because of that. She kind of wears her heart and her spirit on her sleeve, and at the same time, she's wildly intellectual. So it's just magical what she does, and not literal, her interpretation of the text always. She's starred in my musicals. She starred in a musical I wrote called Miss You Like Hell. She starred in the film version of In the Heights. She was in Daphne's Dive at Signature Theater. So this will continue, give her a different chance to explore kind of different nooks and crannies of the kind of writing that I'm doing.
Great, thank you. So as you've touched on a bit, the play and the book focus, or the play in particular, I guess, focuses on the women of your family. Would you talk about some of those women and how they've influenced you?
back in Puerto Rico, our family had a farm. So we were an agrarian family. There were a lot of daughters, there were fewer sons, and it was a poor rural agrarian life. When the women left and came to Philadelphia, it was a whole new world, and there was not a huge Puerto Rican community to welcome them. There was a small and developing Puerto Rican community to welcome them. And what that means is that there were not like services to help them find their way. They had to create those services. There were not community centers that were bilingual where they could just go and meet other people. They had to build these spaces themselves. So when I say that my elders, the generation above me, built Philadelphia, I mean it quite literally. My generation, we inherited the Philadelphia that they built. So it became incumbent on us. We had more time. I had more time to tell the story of what they had done. They didn't have time to tell the story because they were living the story. But if those stories didn't get told, they really wouldn't become part of the written record. That's why I write about elders in the community. It's why I write about people like Titi Ginny, who started an amazing gardening project. She found abandoned lots in North Philly and bought them from the city for $1, and they made community gardens in them. And it sounds cute and sweet in this kind of COVID moment of like trending houseplants and stuff, but actually it was really urgent work. A lot of them were displaced farmers. And so this created a way that their body could find connection with the earth, even in a largely concrete new setting. There was Tia Rosa, who was leading protests against the racial profiling that the Federation of Police was in the habit of doing. They would do roundups and sweeps of entire communities of men because of one street crime. So they were fast at work building these spaces. My mother she created something called Casa Comadre. She was working in maternal health care because our infant mortality rates were very poor. Our access to bilingual healthcare and culturally sensitive healthcare did not exist. And so my mom was on a high school education. She wasn't college educated. She didn't have time for that. She had to get to work and advocate for these services now because she saw her niece, she saw her cousin, she saw her neighbor pregnant without even prenatal vitamins. So these were the kind of services and community care work that I saw the elders in my family doing.
What is your own connection to music, and how is that part of the fabric of this book and the play, and translating into how important it was for you that you want to have a musician on stage and really part of the ensemble and the world of the play?
One of the things the play looks at, and one of the reasons why it's called My Broken Language, is that we were often at a loss for words. My mother's first language is Spanish, her second language was English. My first language was English, and my second language was Spanish. And so even just with our spoken languages, I often felt like I didn't have the proper vocabulary to describe my reality and my experiences. Because everyone in the family had a different relationship with Spanish and English, we found other languages that you didn't really get lost in translation. There's a lot of body language. There's a lot of healing language. For me, one of the saving graces of my childhood was learning music. I loved Chopin because I was a depressed kid, and I could just like live that depression out on those 88 keys and get it out of my system and express myself in a way that language kind of failed me. I loved playing Bach because it was so organized and disciplined, and I'm a Virgo, and I'm the oldest child, so I could kind of express those impulses in a musical way. It didn't get lost in translation. And the grown-ups weren't even asking, well, boy, you seem really depressed when you're playing that Chopin piece. Like, they just kind of let me be. After I gave up music in my 20s, I thought, okay, well, I'm moving on to writing. That was a nice part of my life. But when I started to tell intergenerational stories, I remembered the Bach preludes and fugues again and how they look on the page. You know, there's one iteration of the melody here, there's the inverse of the melody here, there's like a slower version of the melody here. They're kind of stacked up on top of each other. And it was almost like a family tree. It was almost like a visual representation of different narrative threads happening at the same time. I was like, this is how I experience life. Like something started to click that the music was also the story for me. I wrote a play called Elliot, A Soldier's Fugue. I don't think that many people had written about a connection between Bach and like agrarian Puerto Ricans who joined the US military. It was kind of an exciting connection for me to make personally. This time I'm digging in again with the music, and we're gonna have a live pianist on stage. Ariadne Trujillo, she's a force of nature. She's a real dynamo on the piano. And like many of us in the cast, she's a multi-artist. She's a singer, she's a composer, she's a pianist. She has these different outlets for her voices. So at a time when there's a scene, a real coming of age scene for an adolescent girl. And it feels fun, it's a comic scene, it feels playful, it feels exciting. And then here comes Ariadne at the end of the scene with a much more thoughtful and pensive piano piece to again give that juxtaposition. How does a fond memory haunt you? How do the changes in life that feel so exciting actually imply reflection and levels of going deeper? So the music is going to add a whole other non-literal, non-verbal component that the audience will have space to also come up with their own interpretations there.
Thank you.
That was long, sorry.
That was great. And what are some of the other languages, literal or otherwise, that are in the play, explored in the play?
My broken language, we have a lot of languages in the play, so let's see if I can remember. There's English and Spanish, the like warring languages in my life always. There's Spanglish, which, you know, actually kind of has its own syntax rules. It's a very playful amalgamation, so we use it creatively. Oftentimes we try to one-up each other on our silly Spanglish. There's body language, there's a lot of dance, there's a lot of touch. The recipe for white rice, you don't measure a cup of rice, you measure by palmfuls. And my abuela, when she taught me how to make white rice, she was like, give me your hand. She showed me how to cup her hand. She taught me how to make white rice by touching me. So there's body language. There's also lukumi and spiritual languages, the languages of the ancestors. My mother is a priest. She's a santera in what's commonly known as santeria, more respectfully known as lukumi. And so part of that was learning Yoruba language because that's the roots from Yoruba land in Nigeria. So learning some of those Yoruba words. It's also learning the visual language of her thrones, which has a really rich, symbolic and meaningful kind of code to it. Far more complicated than I understand, but still I learned some as a child. There's the visual language. I used to go to the Philadelphia Art Museum, so there's a scene there. And I'm looking at Marcel Duchamp, and I'm thinking about the visual language of Marcel Duchamp. And then I'm going home, and I'm looking at Mom's altars in this Afro-descended syncretic pathway. And I'm like, how do I see these two different modalities? Is there a place in my life where they can live side by side? What other languages? We have recipes. Oh, we have like shaming language and slurs, right? One of the fun things about becoming a writer was I could take words that had been kind of weaponized against myself and my loved ones. Words like fat, words like bitch, words like witch, which was very used a lot because people misunderstood my mom's religious practices and spiritual practices. I could take all of these words, and it's like in the cartoon where someone like catches all the bullets in their mouth and then spits them back out, right back at the shooter. It's like I could use these words now and reclaim them and take control of the narrative in that way. So it was really fun to explore all of these different languages vying for space and to balance how do I tell the story on stage with these.
Great, thank you. And speaking of visual language, what is the visual world you're creating on stage with your creative team?
Our visual world reminds me so much of my youth in Philly in the 80s and 90s because it's a mess. It's just like a messy Philly home full of a lot of stuff. I've become kind of allergic to like neat, clean art. Growing up, there was just a lot of stuff around, and we didn't have necessarily all the storage furniture. There wasn't the Container Store. Like, there was no Container Store, okay? It was just like what clothes I could fit in the dresser went in the dresser. Then there would just be a cardboard box and like a trash bag full of off-season clothes or something too. You hold on to things knowing that a kid or someone else in the family might need it. So there was a lot of stuff around. And so I like that. I like living in the mess. I like art that makes a mess. I would see, it was graffiti times, it was breakdancing times in Philly. And so I want to harness those aesthetics visually. We have a lot of bathtubs on stage. We have a shower on stage. We have a lot of books, a lot of plants. Our props are all on stage. So I'm not sure Marie Kondo would totally vibe on our aesthetic, but I'm vibing on it.
Great. This is the second play of 3 in your signature residency. How does this production, if it does, connect back to Daphne's Dive, and what does the residency mean to you now in this moment?
So this is the second of 3 plays I'm doing for signature. First was Daphne's Dive in the same theater. That was done alleyway, so you have the stage and then you have audience on both sides. This one's being done as a 3/4 thrust, so kind of Greek, kind of in the round. I chose that because at the end of the day, this is a play that's based on the simple act of telling a story. Like, hey, you're in my kitchen, pull up a chair, let me tell you a story. It's got that vibe, and so I wanted it to have that direct kind of staging. It's hard for me to analyze my work in the moment and in longer term. So I don't know. Someone else has to do the work of contextualizing it.
Maybe one last question. You've touched on this some, but if you could talk about ritual in the play and art as a healing ritual, which I think is something you've incorporated into the play, and how you have explored that through My Broken Language.
So there are moments of ceremony and ritual in the play, and there's a few roots of that in my personal life. One is the religious ceremonies that I grew up watching. There was no church of Lukumi, of Santeria. Our living rooms were where it happened. So I really grew up around these rituals that were fascinating and dynamic and artistically complicated. There was bata drumming. The bata drums, the patterns are very complicated. They're compelling. It's the voice. It is actually an orisha. It's a spirit that speaks through the drums. So I had that kind of ceremonial language and aesthetic in my heart, in my marrow. On a separate side of the family, on my other side of the family, my aunt composed the music for the Big Apple Circus while I was growing up. So I would come up to New York once a year and hear her circus score and see the circus. So these were the performing arts I grew up with, basically living room ceremony and clowns juggling in my face. So that informed my aesthetic a lot. And so there will be some rituals. I think probably like the clowning, that directly leads to something like a rice ballet where we're literally playing with dry rice on stage. It's just playful, it's silly. The ceremonial stuff is a little more thoughtful. It's a little more intentional and serious. There's a bath. Like during my adolescent depression, Chopin helped. Also, what helped is that the elders in the religion would make me spiritual baths to wash myself and wash away some of that bad energy. So these practices, you'll see echoes of them in this play.